Today's readings all touch on the idea of being aware of everlasting life and how life continues. The thing in Jesus is the idea of approaching death and the things that are done in this world, what matters for eternity and what matters for this world. The Pauline reading tells us who've made our commitment to Jesus or have been redeemed, that we should live in his world, not just in ours. But the first reading is the reading that I think best carries the teaching. The first reading is by an author by the name of Koheleth, and his, I think it was his father, was an ambassador for the king of Israel and traveled around the world. And one of the things he did was collect wisdom sayings, things like a penny saved, a penny earned, that sort of thing. And he collected them in this book that was eventually translated by one of his descendants and became the book of Ecclesiastes. But anyway, in this book, he collects sayings like we have today. And one of the things he noticed was very strange things in the world. Basically, he notices a lack of justice. He says he sees people who work their whole life in order to acquire, let's say, belongings. And then when they have them, they're too old to enjoy them. Or they die, and they leave them to people who will never work a day in their life and will waste it all. He looks at people who lead very good and holy lives, and things don't seem to work out for them, and criminals who do very well. And he goes through all these different things. And I always think it's interesting when a criminal comes to a bad end, that doesn't bother anyone. When a criminal does well, that gets us. Okay? When a really good person does well, that doesn't bother anyone. But when a really good person comes to a bad end, that gets us. And so that's what he meditates on the whole thing in the book. And he is surrounded by so much of this, he's forgotten the basic thing of Judaism, is that death is not the end. That there is something that goes beyond this. And all you and I see is the justice in this world. We don't see the justice of eternity. And that is a basic thing to hold in our beliefs. That ultimately everything works out. It just doesn't necessarily work out on the face of the earth. And I think any time you see any sequence of things, if you stop at the middle of the sequence, you really don't know where things are going. And human life actually stops in the middle of the sequence. In fact, it stops far short of the middle of the sequence. Because you and I believe at the worst, we're going to live 100 years. But eternity is forever. So the life on the face of the earth is really a short part of this. I've shared with you a story before, and I'll share it again. But to me, it is the epitome of a story where people see something in one way, and it turns out to be very different. There was a man in San Luis Obispo who had been in the Holocaust, and he gave a sharing about his experience one night when the Holocaust commemoration is each year. And he did it in the mission in San Luis. And it was, he was in a very small village in Germany where there was a large Jewish contingent in this rural village. And as the Hitler youth groups began to grow in Germany, they used to go around and raid villages where the Jewish people were. And so one evening, the Nazis came into their community, the SS, and told them that they were concerned about them actually being hurt by the youth. So they wanted them to get all their belongings together, and they were going to take them to a place where they would be safe. And they had just a few hours to get ready. And while they were getting ready, his mother was killed. His mother's name was Esther. And she fell under the, the wheel of a cart that was being prepared. And it was really a disaster and everything. And they got in and they went. And I think they ended up in a concentration camp. That's where they went. And when they got in the concentration camp, for the rest of their time in the concentration camp, whenever they pronounced a blessing on anyone, they said, "May your life be like Esther's." Esther died, the last Jew buried in that village. She never knew there were concentration camps. She never knew that there was extermination. She never knew any of those things. The most wonderful thing that could happen to anyone was that they should die in that situation. But you only realize that the next day. And this is the basic teaching we hold in our faith. We do not see beyond the human grave, and the human grave is the beginning of the rest. It is the beginning of the next day. And to see the world in which we live, just in this world, it does not make any sense, and it is unbelievably unjust. But we trust in a God who makes all of that make sense and makes all of it work out. But in order to hold that, I must believe there's something beyond the grave.